animals. So even if the boat sinks, they can get compensated. But when our loved ones die, they can't come back.
Here at the harbour on South Korea's Jeju Island, nervous crews are preparing for their next voyage as government inspectors arrive to check some of their boats. The authorities know there's little they can do about the weather, so they are now trying to make the boats safer. But this offers little comfort to those whose livelihoods and lives are now on the line. Jean McKenzie, BBC News, Namhae in South Korea.
The clocks go back this weekend in some parts of the world, and while for many it means an extra hour in bed, not everyone is a fan of the tradition of daylight saving. Our correspondent David Silito has more.
It's the weekend to change the clocks, an extra hour in bed, but also for some a disruption to sleep patterns, a topic that's of increasing concern.
Today we've got a few songs like Sleeping Bunnies.
Which is what took me to this. The Together Project, a weekly intergenerational get-together to see if attitudes to sleep really are changing. And it soon became clear the older generation were very relaxed about the clock change and also about what bedtimes they'd had over the years.
Very late, actually. I'd stay up sometimes till midnight and watch something or read, and so I didn't have a regular bedtime.
I went to sleep around 11, 12 and got up at 6 o'clock in the morning.
I usually sleep reasonably well, but generally I don't really think about it.
As a young person, I used to try and get to bed very late.
The younger visitors, well, bedtimes were rather different, and the clock change, far from popular.
I would say I typically try to be in bed by about 10 p.m. I sort of see sleep as part of my overall wellness, and it's something that I try to prioritize in my life.
I would generally go to bed around 10.
That's quite early.
Yeah, I love my sleep.
If they didn't do it, would it be better or worse?
I don't think it should be a thing anymore. I think it disrupts a lot of people. I mean, obviously I have a baby and I'm going to have to explore what that means with her, although we might just have to roll with that. But I think everybody seems to dread this time of year. And it's one of those things where I think it had a time and a place when it was first instituted, when we were a farming society, and we're not anymore.
The UK did abolish the clock change in the 60s, but the effects, such as going to school in the dark in the north, led to us reverting back in the 70s. 50 years on, it's sleep health experts leading the campaign against it. America has made moves to abolish it, and there have been multiple attempts in the UK. But this concern about sleep has given us new information about the world's sleep habits. A new global study has been looking at data from thousands of under-mattress sensors that an increasing number of people now use to track their sleep patterns.
In the UK, there does tend to be quite late bedtimes and in turn quite late wake-up times as well. So we're showing about a 11 p.m, 11:30 p.m. bedtime and about a 7:30, 8 a.m. wake-up time.
So, a little insight into our sleeping habits. But would we be better off without this weekend's extra hour? David Silito, BBC News.
Question to ponder. Now let's just take a reminder of the fact that President Zelensky is here in the UK. We can show you the Ukrainian flag flying over Downing Street, where he was greeted by Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, a little earlier, having travelled from Windsor Castle, where he was received by King Charles. Let's just show you the shot we have of the front door of number 10 Downing Street. The two men, the two leaders, still in there talking, the red carpet out. They will shortly cross the street to the Foreign Office, and they will be joined in person and by video by a number of European leaders and the Secretary General of NATO. So the Coalition of the Willing talks will have much more on that for you.
Famous Famous for its spectacular views and rolling hills, the Peak District is the UK's oldest national park. And next year marks its 75th anniversary. In 1932, a group of 400 ramblers staged a mass trespass, hiking up the highest mountain, Kinder Scout, and this proved to be the catalyst for the eventual creation of Britain's national parks. Kinder Scout is now under the protection of the National Trust and is the centre of a major conservation project.
Hey.
Hey! I'm meeting Ranger Chris Lockyer to learn more about the work that they're doing. I hear we're going on an adventure today.
Definitely are. Little
yeah.
adventure up Kinder.
Off we go. The adventure started with some normal countryside traffic. It's a lot better than the London traffic. During the Industrial Revolution, pollution from neighbouring cities destroyed much of Kinder's natural vegetation.
Just when you think it can't get any more bumpy.
For over 20 years, rangers have been working to restore the moors to their original glory. We arrived into a misty cloud and a high wind.
Oh, what is this? Chris, this is quite refreshing, right?
You did ask for an adventure.
I mean, what is the wind speed round here?
So I think it's gusting 40 miles an hour at the moment.
40. Perfect conditions for a hike.
We're doing like a massive programme of blanket bog restoration.
Okay.
And blanket bog is a really important wet landscape on peat soils. Peat soils are incredibly important because they store huge amounts of carbon. So I think per square metre, a peat bog, healthy functioning peat bog, can store more carbon than rainforest.
More than a rainforest? Wow, okay.
When it's in a degraded state, it's actually emitting carbon. So we're looking to restore all of our peatland, get it to that healthy, active state where it's beginning to take in and actually, suck carbon out of the atmosphere.
In order to do that, they have to fly in tons of heather and grass seed to this remote area by helicopter.
Proper ripping in now.
The rangers then plant them along with sphagnum moss, creating a protective layer of vegetation to prevent erosion and rebuild the peat bogs.
So this is it, the summit?
Yeah, the top of Kinder Scout.
So we did it?
We've done it.
Man, all right. I mean, I feel like I kind of want to climb up there just...
Yeah, definitely.
Just for the kicks,
yeah.
Right? We're going to do it. It's not a bad view.
The vegetation monitoring at the top of Kinder ensures the rangers know that their restoration project is working.
So we've got like a good kind of 15 centimetres here, but really we want to have kind of, metres of peat, yes. We're going to push it, yeah.
With these simple metal rods, they can measure the water table and the depth of the peat bogs.
That's way taller than you. Oh yeah, look at that.
We got it though.
I think the impact will be massive. We're stabilising the bare peat. We're getting all that water back into the landscape through the gully blocks and the planting of sphagnum moss. And that's, really helping us in the fight against climate change.
The Travel Show, your essential guide wherever you're heading. Every weekend on BBC News.
One of the only advantages of being the old guy is that I've known every major world leader in the last 30 years, and I've known them personally.
There's a thrill in not necessarily following a straight line, do you know what I mean? Trying things that are different, challenging myself.
I'm an optimist. I'm always believing that anything can be done if you have the will to do it and if you have a clear vision.
Women are still judged by a different metric than men, and certainly judged by a different metric when they do something wrong.
I will continue on with a life of public service, so I will always support the charities and the people that mean so much to me.
When the big names talk, they talk to us.
Live from Downing Street, this is BBC News. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Downing Street, where he's currently holding talks with the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. Then the pair will head to a summit at the Foreign Office with a group of European leaders to discuss further support for Ukraine. The UK is looking to help Kyiv secure more long-range missiles from its allies so Ukraine can expand its strikes deeper into Russia.
I do think that this week we can really bear down on Russian oil and gas. I think there's further we can do on long-range capability.
I'm very thankful to you that we are not alone in this situation from the very beginning of the war.
Well, before President Zelensky headed here to Downing Street, he met King Charles at Windsor Castle.
And I'm Anita McVeigh. The other headlines today. Labour tumbles to a distant third in the Caerphilly by-election with an historic loss to the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru. Donald Trump says he's ending trade negotiations with Canada because of an advert featuring Ronald Reagan. And English football club Sheffield Wednesday has filed for administration, a move that would effectively end Thai tuna magnates' ownership of the Hillsborough club.
Hello and welcome to Downing Street. Well, the red carpet was laid out earlier today and we saw Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky arrive here to Downing Street about 12:30 local time here in London, where he was greeted by Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister. Now, the pair are currently in talks. Before this afternoon, they will head across the road from Downing Street here to the Foreign Office, where they will attend a summit with around 30 other European leaders. Some will be in person, others will be attending via video conference for a summit of the Coalition of the Willing, a group of European allies which is looking to provide more support for Ukraine as the conflict continues. Now, attending that meeting in person, as well as Sir Keir Starmer, will be most significantly the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Now, we will, of course, bring you the news conference after that meeting as well. But before they went into their private talks, we did hear a little bit from President Zelensky and Prime Minister Starmer. Let's have a listen first to what Mr. Zelensky had to say.
Volodymyr, it's really good to be able to welcome you here in Downing Street again for a really important meeting between the two of us, bilaterally, but also for the Coalition of the Willing. And I think you saw His Majesty the King this morning. Yeah. And through seeing His Majesty, through our meeting, and through the Coalition of the Willing, we reaffirm again our support for you and Ukraine.
Just a few moments ago, we just saw President Zelensky cross the street here at Downing Street and he walked across the road here with the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer to the Foreign Office. I think we can show you those images now. Let's have a listen in as the pair are arriving at the Foreign Office now, where they are greeted by crowds waving Ukrainian flags. Let's have a listen in. We're just going to stay on those images. As you can see there, groups of children waving Ukrainian flags as President Zelensky and Prime Minister Starmer talk to some of them before they go into this summit. We can hear some laughter as well. Just to give you some sense of geography, I'm in Downing Street, and there's just a kind of arch that connects Downing Street to the Foreign Office. So just behind the other side of where I'm standing is where the two leaders are. So we can hear a ripple of laughter, a bit of light relief as those children greet President Zelensky. We're going to listen in to see if we can hear anything.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
And we continue to see these pictures as the two leaders meet more people there, holding a Union Jack as well. In fact, that flag there is a mix of the Ukrainian flag and the British flag. And what we saw in Downing Street as well is the Ukrainian flag right above number 10 here as well. This really is a show of support for Ukraine. A big cheer and a wave as those leaders head inside the Foreign Office. And the Prime Minister's being given something. It looks like a Scout badge or something. I'm going to bring Vitaly Shevchenko in from BBC Monitoring because he can answer what exactly is going on in terms of what they're handing over. Vitaly, what's going on here?
So President Zelensky is meeting members of the huge British community of volunteers helping the Ukrainian refugees here in the UK. You can see somebody from Gloucester, Laura Bullivant, who has been active in helping Ukraine. So the British Prime Minister and the Ukrainian President are meeting both Ukrainian refugees and British people helping Ukraine. It's a very touching scene. As you can see, they're wearing Scout uniforms, traditional Ukrainian Vyshyvanka shirts, and it will be so important to both Ukrainians who have had to leave their country and come to the UK, and also British people helping them. And of course, there's Yvette
Cooper as well now, giving President Zelensky a hug as well before she leads the Prime Minister and the President into the Foreign Office.
Yes, and what we're going to see now is a continuation of talks that started at 10 Downing Street. Talks about long-range missiles for Ukraine, air defences for Ukraine, efforts to remove Russian oil and gas from the global markets. And now these conversations will continue in a wider format involving members of the so-called coalition of the willing, more than 30 countries supporting Ukraine. and they will be hoping to produce specific results that will help Ukraine fight the Russian army.
Okay, so Vitaly, they've gone into those talks now. Let's talk about how the afternoon will continue on, because there's a one-on-one meeting there between Prime Minister Starmer and President Zelensky, but now they're going to be meeting with a much broader grouping, including the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte and other leaders, part of the coalition of the willing. Some, like President Macron, will be joining by a video conference. What are we expecting to be announced later?
One of the decisions that Volodymyr Zelensky will be hoping to achieve will relate to how members of this coalition will be buying weapons from the United States for Ukraine. For example, yesterday, the Ukrainian president urged allies from EU member states to give priority to Ukraine when it comes to buying Patriot air defense missiles from America, because in this current situation, everybody needs them. They're expensive, they're sophisticated, and the fact is there's a short supply of them globally. And the Ukrainian president will be arguing that Ukraine needs them more than NATO member states or EU member states. Also, they'll be talking about how money provided by Ukraine's allies can be used to purchase weapons from the United States as part of the Pearl Initiative. What is a key point is America's support for all these initiatives. We've been hearing reports that key Russian negotiator, Kirill Dmitriev, is in the United States to meet American officials. So there's a lot of movement and talks happening right now, and Vladimir Putin of Russia will be watching outcomes from all these meetings keenly. But the fact remains that Ukraine's allies haven't really given the Russian president reason to rethink his strategy towards Ukraine. Russia is still attacking Ukraine. We've heard reports of at least 3 civilians killed in the southern Ukrainian city of Kherson earlier today. So this is just another example of how desperate Ukraine is for assistance from the West, and how its Western allies have failed to stop the Russian attacks.
Okay, Vitaly Shevchenko, for the moment, thank you. And of course, we're still looking at these images that came into us a short while ago at the Foreign Office. So, no, we're not anymore, but we were a second ago. These images at the Foreign Office of the Ukrainian refugees and people supporting Ukrainian refugees, as Vitaly was saying there, greeting the Prime Minister and the President as they then go into the Foreign Office for those talks. Well, I'm joined now by Patrick Bury, former NATO analyst and British Army officer. Welcome to BBC News. Now, what Vitaly was saying just then is, while we see the President and the Prime Minister and various European allies meet here in London, we're hearing that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, is meeting his Russian counterpart. The timing is interesting, isn't it, Patrick?
Good afternoon. It is, but this is also to be expected. Basically, as we've seen, the Russians will do anything they can to destabilize any sense of momentum between Europe, Zelensky, and indeed America. So when Zelensky was in the air to go and meet Trump last week, basically Putin picks up the phone to him. So it's to be expected at this stage. It's just what's going on. Secondly, of course, Trump has announced that in a month's time, those fresh US sanctions on the 2 major Russian oil and gas companies will start. And so you would expect that he's using that as leverage. So you would expect the Russians who don't want this to happen to then start to potentially get in contact again. And obviously they're in contact pretty regularly anyway. So potentially that leverage is working. But let's wait and see. It's a long way to go, and the Russians have a history of threading both President Trump and the Ukrainians along in terms of any hope of a ceasefire deal.
And just on that point, Patrick, we heard from the British government even before the meetings began today that this was all about trying to ratchet up the pressure on Vladimir Putin. And we did see those US sanctions earlier in the week and renewed EU sanctions on Thursday. But I wanted to get your thoughts on how much you think sanctions really play a role in any of this.
I think strategically they're very important if they're done properly, coordinated, and also down to the secondary sanctions. Once the workarounds, the Russians start to use their workarounds, be it the ghost fleets of shipping, shipping containers for their oil and gas. The support from China is another really important thing that needs to be closed off as much as possible. If you do it properly and really starting to tighten the space for the Russians to operate around, and you maintain consensus, crucially from the United States as well, to do so, it will be probably in the longer term the deciding factor. You know, essentially, if your viewers think about what is really going on, is a strategic race that you don't want to win, and that race is basically the first one to collapse. And on the one hand, you have Ukrainian military, which is under pressure, not really looking at in a position to collapse now, but the risk grows as it takes more damage, and the Ukrainian state, including its refineries, its transport network, takes more damage as this goes on. And on the other hand, and slightly behind that at the moment, is the Russian economy. But that is also overheating badly at this stage. And so if you can...
Just to pick up on that point, Patrick, if I want to just pick up on that point, you mentioned infrastructure. We know that one of the things that's going to be discussed this afternoon at the summit here in London is ways that the Coalition of the Willing can do more to support Ukraine's energy infrastructure, given that it's come under attack significantly in the last couple of years since the war began.
Absolutely, and even more recently, as the Ukrainians started to find the pressure point and hit the Russian refineries, it's had its own, I think in the last week, you know, a stat came out that about 60% of Ukrainian gas network is being attacked. So it's under pressure too. And this comes back to my point, just to finish off, what you've got to do with the sanctions is basically tighten that space and slow and increase the rate of attrition of the Russian economy so that the Ukrainians can last longer vis-a-vis it. But yes, this is a point. Air defense is absolutely crucial. I think you'll see some attempts to try to get more systems into Ukraine. But as Vitaly just said, there's a lot of demand now for those pieces, and that was part of the Russian, I'd say, intent in terms of doing incursions into NATO airspace, etc. And I also think there will be this talk about potentially getting the Taurus long-range air-launched cruise missile, or longer-range air-launched cruise missile, to the Ukrainians, which would increase their ability to strike deeper into the Russian heartland.
I want to ask you about that briefly as well, Patrick, because of course there's also been talk about Tomahawks and pressure on the US when it comes to long-range missiles, but the US isn't as keen as European allies to provide that sort of extra support.
No, well, the Tomahawk one obviously has a longer range, so, you know, at least for the variant, they're likely to get, you know, about 1,000 miles, so it opens up a lot more. But it's difficult to work out exactly. It's usually a sea-launched missile. You can launch it from the ground. They're big systems, and there's not many of them that the US has. So there's a question mark about how the Ukrainians would actually do this. But look, they've been very good at fixing stuff to work rapidly, because given that they're in a cycle of adaptation with the Russians. That notwithstanding, I mean, the Tomahawk would also, because the way it flies, I do wonder, would it be more difficult? There's a lot of electronic warfare jamming going on, so some of the GPS guided systems that the Ukrainians have been given aren't working as well anymore. So potentially the way the Tomahawk hugs the ground and uses its own guidance systems might be very useful too. There is also a question about this, though. What the West doesn't really want to do is be drip feeding these systems to the Ukrainians, which they use, and it gives them some effect, and then the Russians adapt and the systems become much less useful down the line, and that's one of the considerations of Tomahawk.
OK, Patrick Bury, thank you very much, as always, for sharing your thoughts and insights as that meeting gets underway. Let's show you the scene live at the Foreign Office, which is where that summit of the Coalition of the Willing is taking place. Just a short while ago, we saw President Zelensky and Prime Minister Starmer enter the Foreign Office. They were greeted by the UK Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper as they go in for their talks. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. I'm Anita McVeigh. Now, one of the day's other big stories, because the US President Donald Trump has announced an immediate end to all trade negotiations with Canada. It's because of an advert that criticises tariffs on the country. The ad, which is sponsored by the government of Canada's Ontario province, quotes former President Ronald Reagan saying that tariffs hurt every American. President Trump responded on social media that the advert was fake and egregious, adding that trade talks were hereby terminated. Now here's some of the advert which provoked that reaction.
But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down.
Well, President Trump has posted again on his Truth Social platform. Let's just show that to you. He says, Canada cheated and got caught. They fraudulently took a big buy ad saying that Ronald Reagan did not like tariffs when actually he loved tariffs for our country and its national security. Canada is trying to illegally influence the US Supreme Court in one of the most important rulings in the history of our country. He says next month the Supreme Court is due to rule on whether President Trump's use of tariffs is lawful or not. And then in the last few minutes, let me just tell you, we have had this response from the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford. He has posted on social media saying, Canada and the United States are friends, neighbours and allies. President Ronald Reagan knew that we are stronger together. God bless Canada and God bless the United States. Well, let's discuss this now with Karleen Verrier, an Associate Vice President at Summer Strategies and a former Chief of Staff of the former Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Karleen, very good to have you with us as ever. And what do you make of this? Well, it's turned into a bit of a social media spat, although the comment there from Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, fairly restrained. He's been pretty bullish in the past, hasn't he?
He has, but his approach has always been consistent from my observation, which is that he tries to speak directly to the American people rather than engaging directly with President Trump. He's done that in media appearances on American networks like CNN and NBC before, and this ad campaign has been running as well on American television networks. And it's his way of trying to tell Americans that the tariffs are bad in the hopes that that will provoke a domestic backlash to the policies the president has put in, because as we know, the tariffs the U.S. has brought in against Canada do make a lot of goods more expensive in the United States. Now, the developments overnight, obviously not difficult to call those positive in the initial reaction. However, as Canadians, we've been through this before with President Trump during the first administration. I think that his unpredictability is his most consistent quality. So we've always had to be prepared that he could turn things around on a dime, walk away from the table at any given time.
Do you think, though, Carleen, that the timing of this ad, sponsored by Ontario, is poor, given that in that recent meeting in the Oval Office between Mark Carney and Donald Trump, the two of them seem to be getting along rather well, much better than previously?
Yes, and there had been a lot of hope in the last week, roughly, that a side deal specifically on the rather punitive U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum was possibly coming together. That would have provided enormous relief to those sectors of the Canadian economy. So in that sense, this timing is a bit of a letdown for a lot of people in those sectors. That being said, it can also be argued that the impact of Trump saying that all talks are off is quite minimal in the rest of the Canadian economy, because roughly 85% of trade between Canada and the U.S. right now is actually tariff-free because of our trade agreement. So until that trade agreement is renewed next year, the idea of walking away from talks doesn't really mean much. What it does do, however, I think is further raise questions in Canada about what our approach should be. Should we be assertive and aggressive the way Premier Ford has been, or should we take a bit more of a docile approach? The Prime Minister, Mark Carney, and the President are actually set to meet in a couple of days in Southeast Asia at the APEC summit. So you can imagine that that conversation will now be a bit more interesting.
And just very briefly, in 30 seconds, Carleen, obviously in the longer term, I mean, the idea of the two countries not talking to one another about trade as neighbours is unsustainable, surely.
Well, it certainly is, and I think the president knows that as well. That's why the conversations have continued throughout this period, despite what he may do in the public domain or on his social media platforms. And the reality is, it is difficult to know what the president may do. Just 2 days ago, he actually spoke publicly about this Canadian ad, saying that he thought it was a good ad and that if he had been Canada, he would probably do the same thing. Okay. This post on Truth Social represents a very different reaction just 2 days later. So
all right,
the only thing Canadians can count on is him changing his mind.
We're out of time. Thank you so much, Carleen Varian. You are watching BBC News. Do stay with us.
on BBC News, the latest from New York and around the world. Business Today.
Live from New York at the opening bell, this is Business Today. US stocks march higher after the latest inflation data fuels optimism of more rate cuts. Picking up, US inflation rose to 3%, the fastest rate since the start of the year, but still less than analysts were expecting. What does it mean for the Fed? And 50 years strong, Iceland celebrates the women's strike that paved the way for gender equality in the country. We speak to the country's leader. Plus, breaking barriers, the Bank of England's chief financial officer, Afua Che, has been named the UK's most influential black person. Welcome to Business Today, live from New York. I'm Michelle Fleury. We start here in the United States, where the latest inflation data out is here. The numbers were delayed, I should say, by the ongoing government shutdown. Consumer prices, they rose 0.3% in September, pushing the annual inflation rate to 3%, the highest since January. This is the first major economic report since the shutdown began, and it comes just days ahead of the Federal Reserve's policy meeting. But we may not see another for a while, the White House saying that because of the shutdown, next month's figures will be delayed. Tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump have contributed so far to rising costs for imported goods, while high rents and medical costs are also hitting consumers hard. The shutdown, we should note, is in its 24th day, making it the second longest in US history, behind the 35-day lapse that we saw in late 2018. Our North America business correspondent, Erin Delmore, has been to visit one store owner in New York to find out how high inflation is impacting her business.
Boomerang Toys has been a fixture in New York City's Tribeca neighborhood for 24 years. But because of tariffs, owner Karen Barwick worries about its future.
How much of the merchandise here is made outside of the U.S.?
I would say probably 95%.
And how much do you think is made in China?
I would say probably 85 to 90%.
Over the last 6 months, the Trump administration has put tariffs in place that are raising the costs of goods in the U.S. Tariffs on imports from China have soared into the triple digits, and small business owners like Karen are paying the price.
Tariffs are a tax on Americans, they're a tax on consumers. No matter what this administration says, or maybe this administration doesn't actually understand who they're hurting and how they're hurting, but it is 100% all of us as American citizens who are feeling this pain.
S&P Global estimates that tariffs will cost businesses in the U.S. an additional $1.2 trillion this year, with 2/3 of those costs being passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices.
These are Coral dolls, are made by a French company, but they are made in China. The price of the dolls have gone up about $15.
She worries that smaller profit margins and slower consumer spending could force her shop to close.
How stressed are you about your ability to continue having this store here?
100% stressed all the time. Unfortunately, I really want to keep this going. I love this store. You know, I've built it from scratch. And I love the community. I love being part of the community. I've watched kids grow from pre-K to college, and I love that. But this is the most difficult time we've ever had to face.
Erin Delmore, BBC News, New York.
The perspective there from one business owner speaking to my colleague Erin Delmore. Well, for The View from Wall Street, I'm joined by Ed Moyer, market intelligence strategist at AlphaSense. Ed, always good to see you on the programme. What is your reaction? What stood out to you in this inflation report?
Thank you, Michelle. Well, Wall Street is embracing this inflation report. I think there was downside surprises, which is clearly showing that the trend of inflation is coming down. Now, the uncertainty for the outlook going forward is going to cloud the visibility on what the Fed can signal, but for the most part, we're not seeing a sharp appreciation. Yes, the tariffs are having an impact, as you could see it with apparel prices, but for the most part, there is signs of a slowdown, and I think the data, for the most part, should allow the Fed to continue with this easing cycle. And for the most part, shelter prices was one of the things that a lot of people were focused on. Now, there was a downside surprise, the slowest pace since 2021, but some economists might kind of hold off on putting a lot of weight on that one reading. So we'll wait until we get the cleaner readings, which might not take place till next year.
So it sounds like you're expecting the Fed to cut next week. Beyond that, what are you looking at? And does it matter that the Fed will be flying blind as we won't have any more data while the shutdown continues?
Well, I think right now the analysts are really, concentrating their efforts on trying to get whatever data they can that will provide clearer signals on the labor market, on inflation. So a lot of this private data, there's tremendous demand for that, and I think you're starting to see more signs about more weakness across lower and middle income households. I think the inflation story has, primarily revolved around tariffs, and we've seen a lot of mitigation efforts, regionalizations. These costs are, being reflected in these earnings results, and I think for the most part, not much has really changed. I think there's still a firm belief that we will get more rate cuts.
You mentioned their tariffs and the role that trade has played in all of this. Donald Trump said he was ending trade talks overnight with Canada because of an ad campaign launched by the province of Ontario. That was set to air on American television and featured President Ronald Reagan speaking negatively about tariffs. How much of an issue do you think that's going to be for the economy, both here and north of the border?
The coverage with that tweet is going to be, I think, a big focus for a lot of people. But I think we should, remind ourselves next week is going to be a pivotal week, not just with trade talks with President Trump and Carney. You're going to see Trump and Xi remain a big focal point. I think there is this overall belief that you'll see heightened threats leading up to these gatherings, but for the most part, I think the consensus on the street is that you'll probably see some type of de-escalation, some type of compromise, that we'll see an extension of some tariff relief. I think both, these excessive tariffs would punish both economies. So I think there's not an expectation that this will actually be how things unfold.
Yeah, all eyes turn to Asia, as you say, for that meeting next week between Xi and Trump. Ed Moyer from AlphaSense, always good to chat.
Thank you.
Now, 50 years ago today, Iceland came to a standstill as 90% of its women walked off the job in a powerful stand for equality. 25,000 filled Reykjavik's main square, a strike that sparked change and led to Iceland's Equal Rights Act the following year. Today, Iceland still leads the world in gender parity, topping the Global Gender Gap Report for the 16th straight year. And to mark the milestone, Prime Minister Kristin Frostadóttir spoke with our very own Julia Caesar about the strike's lasting legacy and how Iceland is navigating today's global economy.
There's an immense sense of pride among Icelanders, not just Icelandic women, but Icelanders as a whole, about the impact that this made both here but also globally. And it also, I think, just sends such a clear message of how important women are, how important it is that women participate in the workforce, because that's always been our strength, that we've had a high participation of women in the workplace here. So we need to carry that information forward.
Now, many economies have been struggling recently. How is the Icelandic economy faring?
Inflation and interest rates is always a big topic here. I mean, you won't meet an Icelander who doesn't know what the inflation rate is. It's very stubborn here, inflation, and is still around 4%, and we would like to see it go lower. So we're focusing on elements in the housing market and also balancing the budget here on the governmental side to keep that down. So challenges that a lot of economies are dealing with, but I think the message out there is that we're diversifying, we're trying to increase productivity here and high value jobs. So this growth will be strong for our economy.
How do you see trade and the global economy impacting what you want to do over perhaps, say, the next few years?
Everyone is concerned about the change in tone when it comes to international trade. I will say that very honestly. I mean, Icelanders have built a strong economy here and a good relationship with our next neighbors, and it's obviously concerning change if we're going towards more tariffs. I am willing to be, and Iceland is willing to be an active engager in those discussions, how we can do better in multilateralism. But anything that we can do to reduce the international tensions when it comes to tariffs is very important for a small country like Iceland, and to most countries in this world, to be honest.
Now, turning to the UK, where barriers are being broken, the Chief Financial Officer of the Bank of England, the UK's central bank, has been named the country's most influential black person. Afua Che, who oversees the bank's £1 trillion balance sheet, tops this year's Power List, which celebrates black excellence and leadership across Britain. Our UK correspondent, Adina Campbell, met the trailblazing finance leader who's breaking barriers at the heart of one of the world's most powerful financial institutions.
Afua Che has always aimed high. After achieving 6 A-levels, she went on to study chemistry at Oxford University. As one of the country's most senior financial leaders, as CFO at the Bank of England, the mum of 4 has now topped this year's Black Power List, which celebrates the most influential black people in the UK.
It's incredibly humbling, and it's showcasing black talent and showing that we have black leaders excelling in all fields and all industries.
Your first job in financial services, when did that start, and how much of an effect has that had on kind of your career so far?
After university, I trained to be a chartered accountant in London, and then I became an investment banker, and I got my first Chief Financial Officer role in a corporate bank, and I did that for about 7 years, and I then was recruited to become the Chief Financial Officer of the Bank of England, and at the time Mark Carney was the governor, and he now is of course the Prime Minister of Canada. I'm responsible for the financial oversight of our balance sheet, which was over £1.1 trillion during the pandemic and has now come down to about 870 billion.
£1 trillion. Most people will be wondering, what does that even look like? That's an incredible amount of money.
Huge amount of money. And I'm also responsible for helping to shape the Bank of England's strategy.
And for people who think, how can someone in such a senior position in one of, such an important institution in the UK have that work-life balance? How do you do it? What's your mantra?
You know what? Growing up, particularly in an investment bank, I didn't see so many women in big leadership roles who had families. And I know that there are lots of women who think that they need to choose between work and having a family. But actually, what I love about the Bank of England is that we really support working families and working parents. The most important choice to make is the culture of the organisation that you're actually joining. You don't need to choose between work and family, just choose the right culture.
Thanks for watching Business Today. Goodbye.
The BBC was always on in the Mashiri house, and my dream actually was to be a BBC News presenter. I want to be for others what the BBC was for us, a trusted source of stability and hope. For me, Trust is about presence, about fostering relationships all around the world over years. So when a story breaks, we're not chasing a lead, we're already there. I'm Marianne Mashiri on The World Today for BBC News.
I'm Anita McVeigh. You're watching BBC News Now. Here, the Labour Party has suffered an historic loss in the Welsh Parliament by-election for Caerphilly, an area it had dominated for 100 years. The Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru, won the seat with 47% of the vote, with Reform coming second, pushing Labour to third. Plaid have said that voters in South Wales chose progress over the tired status quo. Our Wales correspondent, Thomas Morgan, reports.
On a brilliant autumn's day, the sun was shining over the second largest castle in the UK.
How do you feel, Mr Whittle?
Plaid Cymru victorious for the first time here in Caerphilly. It was their candidate's 14th time of trying. And a comfortable victory here in the end, the party buoyant that this was just the beginning.
And I will work like a Trojan for every single man, woman and child in this constituency, and a huge honour it is for me. I am genuinely humbled. I'm a council houseboy from the council estate there, and I'm proud to call this home.
For 100 years, Caerphilly has returned a Labour politician in Westminster and has always been theirs since devolution. But no more, it seems. For many living here, it was a combination of cutting local services by the Labour-run council, the Welsh Labour government's record on the NHS and education, and UK Labour's problems to blame for its downfall.
Well, I'm not happy with the way the hospitals are run. We've got to go all the way to Cwmbran and, not happy about that.
I cannot see the situation improving. We haven't had the funding perhaps that we should have had, which points the finger at Westminster, even though it was promised when they were in opposition.
Whereas others said it was just time for a change.
We've got to give someone else a go. I think Labour, they've run their course, We need to change it, Caerphilly.
I give public notice that Lindsay Whittle is duly elected as the member of the Senate.
Labour's First Minister acknowledged that this was always going to be a tough contest, and that it was, hemorrhaging votes. She also admitted that all levels of the Labour Party needed to shoulder the blame for today's result.
This was a bad result for Labour, and I'd like to start by congratulating Lindsay Whittle on his election to the Senedd. It was a difficult election for us. It was done against the backdrop of Hefin David's death. There are some serious lessons for us to learn here at all levels of government, and we will heed those lessons.
Polling and the bookies had suggested this was looking like a two-horse race between Plaid and Reform. Reform coming second, but their support ballooning in such a short space of time.
Tonight wasn't the night, but if you look at the work we've put in here in this election, the momentum we've built, I'm proud of the campaign we've run, and it's only going to get better. Our ground campaign is going to get better, and I think next May we're going to form a Reform government. So I'm looking forward to that.
An historic location and an historic result for Plaid Cymru. And the question now will be, is this a start of a new political era in Welsh politics, with next year's Senedd elections looming?
The Championship football club Sheffield Wednesday has been placed in administration. It faces multiple financial issues, including owing £1 million in taxes. The club, owned by the Thai businessman Datepon Chansiri, has received an automatic 12-point deduction by the English Football League for going into administration, although it's already languishing at the bottom of the table. Let's get more on this with our sports presenter, Ben Croucher. So, Ben, what does this mean on and off the pitch?
Yes, as you say, Anita, two elements to this. Let's start with the business one. So administrators are now going to come in and take over the day-to-day running of the club. And this is going to effectively end the tumultuous 10-year reign of their owner, Dejphon Chansiri, after players and staff haven't been paid on time in recent months. They've even started ripping up the seats bearing Chansiri's name at Hillsborough as we speak. Now, we understand that potential new owners are already in active discussions with administrators. What about the football side, though? Well, Sheffield Wednesday play in England's second tier, 25 years since they were in the top flight. Those financial breaches have brought sporting penalties. Administration, as you say, means they've been handed a 12-point deduction, already bottom of the Championship. They're 15 points from safety now, highly likely to return to League One. And we've seen fan boycotts in the last week against the owner. Administrators say that if fans come back as soon as Saturday against Oxford United, they will be able to cover their running costs and not anticipating any impact on fulfilling fixtures. There was concern that that could be the case at the start of the season when they had a new manager and only 15 senior players. But administration could see players sold for maybe less than market value in January, which will negatively impact on their chances of staying up. A previous punishment means they're already restricted from paying money for new players.
So how have fans and others been reacting to the news, Ben?
Well, in the last hour or so, we've heard from Sheffield Wednesday's manager, Henrik Pedersen. He says it's a tough day to go into administration, but also a necessary day. I always focus on the future when I close my eyes. I can see a bright future for Sheffield Wednesday. Staff, players, fans support each other to make this club a top club, again, what it deserves and what the fans deserve. He also called it a sad situation as well. Now, we've heard from one of the administrators too. Chris Wigfield says now more than ever we need fans back in the ground, buying tickets, merchandise, pies and pints, and every penny spent will go directly to supporting the day-to-day running costs and not the former owner of the professional. And the fans say they are optimistic. It's a bittersweet day, but they're hoping that this can be a chance to move forward in the future.
OK, Ben, thank you very much. Ben Croucher. Analysis by the BBC shows the number of 16 to 24-year-olds in England reporting symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, has more than tripled in the last 10 years. The charity OCD Action says it's a crisis the government must take seriously. The BBC began to investigate when a number of young people contacted us through Your Voice, Your BBC, to say they couldn't access treatment for their symptoms. Sophie Hutchinson reports.
It's a little dictator in your mind, dictating everything around your life. And it's a little bully. And everything you care about and love so much, it attacks.
Sophie's just finished drama school, which she loved, but it wasn't always easy getting there. She has OCD, which causes her to repeat simple daily actions over and over again.
It's really difficult because it takes over your full day. Even something as small as getting a shower, cleaning your teeth, go to the toilet.
OCD, or obsessive-compulsive disorder, is a common mental health condition characterised by people repeating actions in order to manage intrusive and distressing thoughts.
I'm really, really good at hiding it, but behind closed doors, it's sheer panic. And a lot of people do associate OCD with cleanliness and being clean, and it is so much more than that.
Sophie and other families contacted us through Your Voice, Your BBC News.
Show you Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, speaking. Let's listen in.
Are ready to have those discussions because it will be for the benefit of workers in the United States, workers in Canada, and families in both of our countries. Now, what we can control, absolutely, is how we build here at home. And that's the focus of Budget 2025, generational investment here in Canada. And what we can also control, or at least heavily influence, is developing new partnerships and opportunities, including with the economic giants of Asia, which is the focus of this trip. En français, pendant des mois, j'ai souligné il faut d'instiguer.
Mark Carney now speaking in French, and he is responding, of course, to the news that President Trump has stopped trade negotiations with Canada as a result of an ad sponsored by the province, the Canadian province of Ontario, which uses a clip of Ronald Reagan from about 40 years ago, where he says tariffs are bad for all Americans. Now, Donald Trump says that has been taken out of context, the speech that Ronald Reagan gave, although our own analysis here at BBC Verify does show that the broad theme of the speech by Ronald Reagan was that he did not like the use of tariffs. Well, Mark Carney is saying that they stand ready to pick up on any discussions. He's been saying that Canada can't control the trade policy of the United States, but that Canadian officials have been working on the negotiations, which, and we saw him with Donald Trump in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago, look to have been improving. So those lines coming from the Canadian Prime Minister.
Nos nouveaux partenariats, surtout en Asie avec les géants.
So just a reminder, this is Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, responding to the decision by Donald Trump to stop the trade negotiations with the USA's northern neighbour. Mr. Carney flying to Asia for trade discussions there. Just that key line to repeat for you, saying that Canada cannot control the trade policy of the United States. A little earlier we saw reaction from Doug Ford, the Premier of the Canadian province of Ontario, which sponsored this ad featuring Ronald Reagan, saying that there had to be good relations between the USA and Canada. More on that story and all the day's other main news coming up for you on Verified Live with Matthew.
One of the only advantages of being the old guy is that I've known every major world leader in the last 30 years, and I've known them personally.
There's a thrill in not necessarily following a straight line, do you know what I mean? Trying things that are different, challenging myself.
I'm an optimist. I'm always believing that anything can be done if you have the will to do it and if you have a clear vision.
Women are still judged by a different metric than men, and certainly judged by a different metric when they do something wrong.
I will continue on with a life of public service, so I will always support the charities and the people that mean so much to me.
When the big names talk, they talk to us.
Live from London, this is BBC News. A warm reception for President Zelensky in London for talks with European leaders about boosting military assistance for Ukraine.
I do think that this week we can really bear down on Russian oil and gas. I think there's further we can do on long-range capability.
I'm very thankful to you that we are not alone in this situation from the very beginning of war.
Earlier today, King Charles hosted the Ukrainian president at Windsor.
I'm Regina Vaidyanathan, live in Downing Street. A short while ago, President Zelensky and Prime Minister Starmer headed to the Foreign Office, where that summit with the Coalition of the Willing is underway. We'll have the very latest.
Our other headlines: Labour tumbles to a distant third in the Caerphilly by-election with an historic loss to the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru. Donald Trump says he's ending trade negotiations with Canada after the Canadians air an advert using archive footage of Ronald Reagan saying tariffs don't work. And the rise in reported cases of OCD in young people in the UK. We speak with those waiting for treatment who say it's not being taken seriously enough. Hello and welcome to Verified Live. We start with that hugely important meeting that is going on now, the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Well, President Zelensky spent a few hours in Downing Street with the UK Prime Minister. Great pictures these, as he then headed with Keir Starmer to a meeting with other European leaders who supported Ukraine in the war against Russia. Keir Starmer is expected to push European allies to give Ukraine more long-range weapons. Well, a little earlier, the Ukrainian president held talks with King Charles at Windsor Castle, the third meeting between the two this year. So let's go live to Downing Street and my colleague Regina Vaidyanathan, who's there for us. And Regina, just set the scene for us.
Well, Matthew, it's been a long week in diplomacy when it comes to Ukraine, because you may remember that it was only last Friday that President Volodymyr Zelensky was actually in Washington, D.C., where he met President Trump in the Oval Office. And as you also may remember, reports said that their meeting descended into a shouting match. Well, fast forward a week and he is here in London. He had a one-on-one meeting here in Downing Street with Prime Minister Starmer this morning. And then we saw the pair make the short walking journey from here in Downing Street to the building on the other side here, which is the Foreign Office, where they are joined by a number of European leaders, the Dutch Prime Minister, the Danish Prime Minister, and indeed the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, as well as other leaders joining by video conference for that so-called Coalition of the Willing summit, where they're expected to push for more support for Ukraine, not just in terms of military assistance or financial assistance even, but also looking at ways to support Ukraine's energy infrastructure, for example. Now, it's interesting because we look back a week ago to the meeting with President Trump, and it reminds many viewers, of course, of that first meeting since President Trump returned to office between him and Mr. Zelensky, which really was quite tense and awkward, and it was infamous, of course, because of the tension between the pair. But the first place and the first country that President Zelensky then went to after all of that was here to the UK, where he was greeted by Prime Minister Starmer. And we saw a similarly warm welcome here today. A reminder, really, Matthew, of the strong bond between the UK and Ukraine and the level of support that the UK is willing to extend to the country. Well, let's have a listen to the two leaders speaking before they went into their private meeting.
We reaffirm again our support for you and Ukraine and our absolute commitment to meeting the challenge of Russian aggression. And whilst you have signalled the path for a way forward and shown that willingness and courage and determination, what we've seen from Putin is an absolute unwillingness to engage.
Putin doesn't show that he wants to stop the war, and he really began steps in pushing us to such humanitarian disaster. What he wants to organize this winter is, of course, with attacks on energy, on gas, on water supplies. It's understandable what to do. I'm very thankful to you that we are not alone in this situation.
President Zelensky making comments there, and also we heard from Prime Minister Starmer. I'm joined by BBC Monitoring's Vitaly Shevchenko. So, Vitaly, that meeting taking place right now with the Coalition of the Willing. We've spoken many times on the BBC News channel about this Coalition of the Willing meeting in person or virtually. Many viewers will say, what makes this meeting different?
Well, the hope is that this meeting will at least ensure that Ukraine will be getting the same amount of support as it was getting earlier, because over the recent months it has been falling to a large extent because of a change of administration in Washington. America is now selling weapons to Ukraine's allies, which are then passing those weapons to Ukraine. The best case scenario, and I do think it's very, very unlikely, is that these volumes of assistance to Ukraine will go up. But that is unlikely. The reason why I think that's unlikely is because so far, after meetings in Brussels yesterday, Ukraine's allies had been unable to come up with dramatically new decisions that would help Ukraine. Decisions, for example, on supplying new weapons, more powerful weapons, or even using Russia's seized assets, frozen assets held in Europe to secure a massive loan for Ukraine. That has not happened yet. So what I am realistically expecting are statements about continued support for Ukraine in terms of financial assistance and weapons assistance. It would be slightly unusual for us to hear announcements of specific new weapons being given to Ukraine, but Volodymyr Zelensky has been engaged in frantic diplomacy, trying to at least maintain levels of support, and we'll see what happens today. OK,
Vitaly, thank you very much. Well, Vitaly there mentioning, of course, the need from Ukraine for more long-range missiles and weapons, and we have heard in the past about a request for Tomahawks from the United States to be sent to Ukraine, and that's something that we know the US administration is a bit reluctant on. Well, let's go to Kyiv and join our correspondent there, John Sudworth. So, John, we saw overnight that there were attacks on both sides of the conflict. A reminder, of course, that the war does continue on as the summits continue to take place. What is the feeling from where you are about what are the biggest needs and what might be achieved from today, especially as the cold winter months are about to set in?
Well, it's sometimes difficult, Regini, to follow the twists and turns and the ups and downs of Ukraine's efforts to rally allies to its support, even from the outside, let alone from Kyiv's position fighting this war. You know, as we've seen in recent weeks, so often disappointed in Washington. That meeting you've mentioned back in February, the sort of probably the low point. But reports of another difficult meeting within the past week or so. And so, you know, almost in inverse proportion to that, we've had Ukraine's European allies having to shore up support, having to rally to its defence. And again, we're seeing a display of that today in London. A couple of things I think are really important. First of all, you know, despite President Zelensky coming away from that meeting in Washington somewhat disappointed over Donald Trump's refusal to let him use these long-range US Tomahawk missiles, America has now, for the first time under this administration, you know, put in place a pretty stringent measure of sanctions against Russia's two biggest oil companies. Does that mean things are shifting again, that President Trump is finally running out of patience with Vladimir Putin? We simply don't know. Certainly no rush yet to give it long long-range missiles, that still remains on hold, but a glimmer of hope. And I think this meeting in London, the really interesting thing to watch is the announcements that are made after in regard to that long-range weaponry, because Keir Starmer made it clear that he was going to push European allies to do more so that Ukraine can do what it really needs, what it's been asking to be given the ability to do for a long, long time, to increase its ability to strike targets inside Russia and take the fight to Moscow to put pressure on Vladimir Putin.
John Sudworth, for the moment from Kyiv, thank you very much. Well, it's worth mentioning that we are hearing that Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, has been meeting with his Russian counterpart. That's significant because, of course, that reported meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin that Mr. Trump said would take place in the next fortnight then appeared to have been shelved a couple of days ago. But it does look like dialogue between America and Russia is up and running. Now, in terms of the diary for this afternoon, Matthew, we are expecting a news conference once that summit of the Coalition of the Willing concludes. So Keir Starmer, President Zelensky and the Secretary-General of NATO, Mark Rutte, will be addressing the media and taking some questions. And we will, of course, bring that live here on the BBC News Channel.
Regina, thanks very much. Well, let's continue with this. Let's speak live to Edward Luce, US national editor and columnist at the Financial Times. Edward, great to have you on the programme. This time last week, we saw that image of President Zelensky head in hands in that meeting with Donald Trump. So how important is today's meeting, do you think?
I think it's important. I mean, clearly, Trump over the last few months has been influenced by European leaders linking arms with Zelensky and attempting to counterbalance Trump's perceived, and I think probably well-perceived, desire to cut corners and get a deal done with Putin. And so this is part of that effort that has had some success. Zelensky, remember at this meeting, this rather notorious meeting that he had last Friday with Trump, brought out the maps, as he always does, to show Trump that actually Putin isn't sort of running ravage over Ukraine, and that the progress the Russian military have made this year at enormous expense of lives has been fractional, tiny, because Trump has a strong belief that Putin could simply destroy Ukraine if he wanted to. And according to our reporters who sort of scooped on this, Trump just swept the map off the table. He didn't want to see the map. So these sanctions on the two big Russian oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft, have come as quite a surprise.
Yes.
And I think a positive shock, if you like.
I suspect that was linked too with the hope that some sort of Budapest summit might happen. That seemed to completely fizzle out, and so we saw that move from the US. It was fascinating, actually, the FT's reporting about last week's meeting, the expletives, the maps being thrown, all of the things that you just mentioned. But Zelensky went hoping to get the green light on Tomahawk missiles. That, of course, didn't happen. Is it time for the Europeans to in a sense, cut loose from the White House and actually try to supply these weapons, not the Tomahawks, but other Storm Shadows that the Brits have already given, the Taurus missiles that Ukraine has asked Germany for a long while now, to green light those?
It is time, and I think, ironically, if Europe does step up with that kind of thing, and Britain and France can get these Storm Shadows going to Ukraine in greater volume, of course, that does require US permission for the targeting technology in those Storm Shadows. But if the Europeans do step up, genuine heavy weaponry, including long-range artillery, that's likelier to get Trump's attention and Trump's desire to pile in on this and sell things like more Patriot defense systems to Ukraine. So the Europeans will get more attention the more money they spend and the more heavy artillery they send. That's just how Trump works.
Really quick thought, because the Kremlin has warned of serious responses if the Tomahawks are ever given. Do you take that seriously? Because at each moment, whether it's the Abrams tanks or F-16s, there's been a hesitation from the US because of exactly those sorts of threats.
Yes, and indeed, we saw this through the Biden administration, that when the ATACMS and HIMARS and the US artillery material was being debated as aid packages for Ukraine, Putin actually made nuclear red line very thick hints. Eventually, Biden, a couple of years later, did start sending them. No such red lines were crossed. So I think there's quite a lot of bluff going on there. I don't think, as time's gone on, people take Putin's bluff nearly as seriously as they used to.
Edward Luce, great to have you on the programme. Thanks very much. We are about to take a break. When we're back, we'll talk to Bill Browder on some of those financial sanctions that we've already had announced this week and what more can be done in that European meeting. He's ready to give us an interview, his thoughts live on the programme, and that's next here on BBC News. Around the world and across the UK, you are watching BBC News. Welcome back to Verified Live. Let's continue with that meeting that is currently happening, the Coalition of the Willing in Whitehall. The European leaders discussing the latest situation with President Zelensky. Let's talk to Bill Browder, who was expelled from Russia back in 2005 for exposing corruption in state-owned companies. He has campaigned in the years since. And Bill, great to have you back on the programme. Let's take this in stages, because how important, first of all, was it for the US to sanction those big two Russian oil companies earlier in the week?
I think it's a complete change in the whole tone of the Trump administration policy towards Ukraine and towards Russia. Up until that moment, there had been a lot of going back and forth in terms of words, but the fundamental situation is that Trump cut off military aid for Ukraine and had not done anything more substantial to punish Putin. And so this is, I've always said that we need to watch Trump's actions, not his words. And this was a very substantial action to go after and sanction the two largest Russian oil companies that produce 50% of Russia's oil, I think is very significant. So I think it's a very strong step in the right direction. There's a lot of question marks still about what's going to happen and how it's going to be followed through. But as a big supporter of Ukraine, I was very happy to see that.
And there seems to be clear indications now that India and China may be about to cut imports of Russian oil. If that was to be the case, just how significant would that be, do you think?
I think it would be a game changer. Those two countries have supplied most of the money to Russia since the war started. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in the form of purchases, dollars to purchase Russian oil. If that money isn't flowing to Russia, there's not a lot of other places where Russia can sell its oil, particularly with these sanctions in place. And therefore, I think that Putin becomes really hamstrung when it comes to generating income to continue his war. Now, it's not going to, the results are not going to be seen right away, but I think that in 6 months' time, if those countries genuinely do stop buying Russian oil, I think Putin will be on his knees financially.
In terms of frozen assets, we have talked about that before. Trump has pressed the pause button on that in the last week. Also, there's not unanimity among European countries. Can you understand why that lever hasn't been pulled, given all sorts of European commitments on military spending and pledges to Ukraine and how that has to be paid?
Well, so this is one of the things that doesn't make any sense to me. So on one hand, President Trump sanctions the most important companies in Russia. And on the other hand, he pulls back and he says that the United States is not going to support the confiscation of the Russian central bank reserves, the frozen assets. That doesn't make any sense. It's inconsistent. And it's also inconsistent with the words and policy of the United States leading up till now, both from the previous administration and from Trump's own Treasury Secretary. Scott Bessent had been encouraging Europeans to move forward and confiscate these assets. And so all of this whiplash of, pro-Putin, pro-Zelensky, all back and forth, doesn't look like a very coherent foreign policy of the United States towards Russia. And this is, of course, one of the most important things other than military aid and other than cutting off Russian oil is to get the money into the Ukrainians' hands from those frozen assets so that they can continue to buy weapons to defend themselves.
Well, we shall see if there's any progress on that particular issue or any of the others that we've discussed. Bill Browder, great to have you on the programme. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Plenty more on that story coming up. Let us turn to politics here, because Labour has suffered an historic loss in the Welsh parliamentary by-election for Caerphilly, an area it had dominated for 100 years. Plaid Cymru won the seat with 47% of the vote, with Reform coming second, pushing Labour into third. Plaid Cymru have said that voters in South Wales choose progress over the tired status quo. Well, let's talk live to Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. John, great to have you here on the programme. Give me your top-line analysis of what you saw overnight.
Well, the big question we were looking to this by-election to answer was the polling evidence that in Wales, limited as it was, that Labour were at risk of coming third in the general Senate election that is taking place in May next year, when the whole of the Assembly will be elected. The risk that they would come third, and indeed the suggestion by some polling that they might come a very poor third. Was there any reason to believe there was any credibility to that polling? The answer that came back from the voters of Caerphilly is that risk does exist. The Labour Party has already said this is a constituency that ever since it was first created in 1918, Labour has always won. Go back to the days of when Tony Blair was first elected Prime Minister. Labour got 2/3 of the vote in the constituency. They got just 11%. Yes. On Thursday. So this was a very dramatic loss for Labour. Yep. The truth is, there are clearly good reason to anticipate that Labour would be in difficulty in Wales. Number one is that the party has been criticised for quite some time for its governance of Wales as the devolved government for Wales. And we saw in the general election last year support for the party fall back in Wales by 4 points when it was advancing in most of the rest of England and of Scotland. And secondly, of course, this by-election has taken place at a time when the UK Labour government, its polling rating is just 20%. It is an all-time low, and there is clearly deep dissatisfaction with many voters throughout the UK who voted Labour last year and who are now rather disenchanted. Put those two things together, and you can see why this was a very, very difficult seat for Labour to defend despite its history.
Two quick points in one, if you would. The two main parties, you've alluded to it, 13% of the vote in total between Labour and Conservatives. We're running into new territory, aren't we, of a fractured landscape. There was also tactical voting. People knew it was a straight fight between Plaid and Reform, and I suppose in terms of those wavering, made sure that it wasn't Reform.
Well, I did pick up your 2 points. Yes, the other big question that we're facing at the moment about the future of British politics is, are we beginning to see the death of the traditional two-party system where our politics is dominated by Conservative and Labour? Their share of the vote in the general election last year was at an all-time low. And now, as you say, just 13% in this by-election. Caerphilly indicates that the question of the future of our politics for the two largest parties is a very, very live issue. Tactical voting, yes, probably Reform benefit from this. Labour are trying to take some comfort from that, but the trouble is the message that comes from Caerphilly is that indeed, if you want to defeat reform, Plaid seems to be a better place to do it. That's also the message from the polling in Wales. And the risk for Labour is that some voters will take the message that that's exactly what they should also do next May.
I suppose that's what the Greens too are running with. Just a broader thought about any sort of wider trend that we're seeing in Western politics. Because if you look at the US, for example, you've got a government shutdown with difficult issues being sidestepped. You look at France, and you've had 5 prime ministers in 2 years with no one able to pass a budget that cuts their huge deficit. You have people wanting quick results. And the reality perhaps is there are no quick results when it comes to solving some of these deep-seated issues.
Well, there is no doubt that, and there's no sense that this is unique in this respect, that the Labour government came to power last year with a very difficult legacy, which itself was not necessarily simply the fault of the previous Conservative government. We are talking about a country which, in the wake of the financial crash, has struggled to achieve economic growth. That's true of much of the so-called advanced industrial world, where our public services, despite record levels of spending and us having maxed out our fiscal credit card, they are struggling to recover from the pandemic. And of course, there is this continuing gap between rhetoric and reality on the question of immigration. Turning any of these around is going to be difficult. The problem perhaps is, in some sense, is that Labour didn't prepare people enough in last year's general election for both the measures that it might take and the difficulty that it might have in being able to turn things around.
Yes.
The problem is if you raise people's expectations too much and you don't meet them, you are always at risk of losing their support.
And 30 seconds, if you would, because in the short term, it potentially gets harder, doesn't it? Because they've got a tough budget coming up.
Yep, economic growth is still elusive. Improving the public services is proving to be difficult. And given the fiscal situation, there is a lot of speculation as to whether or not Labour are going to be forced to break a major pledge at the last election, which was not to increase the basic rate of income tax, national insurance or VAT. Rumour has it that an increase in income tax might be on the cards. The truth is that it may be the only sensible answer course for the Chancellor to pursue, but it could be politically a very risky one.
Professor John Curtice, we are out of time. Thank you so much, though, for your time, your analysis here on BBC News. We will have plenty more on all of our main stories. That is coming up here in just a moment or two. Don't go away. Welcome back to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here. A warm reception for President Zelensky in London for talks with European leaders about boosting military assistance for Ukraine. We will talk live on this programme to Ukraine's former President Petro Poroshenko here in the next few minutes. In our other headlines, Labour tumbles to a distant third in the Caerphilly by-election with an historic loss to the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru. BBC Verify has been looking into the bulldozers working at the White House and what Donald Trump has been saying, what the pictures reveal, why the demolition has got Americans so on edge. Of course, they are constructing a ballroom. And the English football club Sheffield Wednesday has filed for administration, a move that would effectively end the Thai magnate's ownership of the Hillsborough club. So let us return to our main story. President Zelensky, he is here in London for that summit of Ukraine's allies, where they'll discuss how to boost Kyiv's defences and increase the pressure on Russia. These are the pictures from about an hour and a half ago after the initial meeting in Number 10, with Keir Starmer and President Zelensky leaving Number 10 Downing Street after their one-to-one talks, heading over to the Foreign Office. Huge cheers from Ukrainian refugees and British supporters who they stopped and spoke to for quite a considerable length of time. Well, the two leaders are currently meeting with some of their European counterparts for the next round of talks. I had a feed of pictures coming in only a short while ago. This is a Zoom link of those pictures. So that coalition of the willing talks, it is still going. Top of the agenda, of course, is Ukraine's request for long-range missiles, and something that Keir Starmer has also been talking to. So that is that meeting. A news conference is expected in about, an hour and 20 minutes. So we will get the main thoughts there of what is coming out of today's meeting when they talk to journalists. But let's speak now live on the programme to the former President of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko. Thank you so much, former President, for being here on the programme. I hope the link is working okay. Tell me a little more about what Ukraine wants to come out of today's meeting. Well, apologies. Clearly you could see that line freezing. We are trying to reconnect the line. So whilst we do that, let me just give you a little more background of what we're actually seeing today, because here we are on a Friday. Last Friday, President Zelensky was meeting with Donald Trump in the White House. He had gone there asking for Tomahawk missiles, and you saw the US President pour cold water on that. And we were showing you the pictures a little earlier with Zelensky head in hands, because that meeting behind the scenes went very badly, with the FT reporting that there were insults, there were expletives from Donald Trump, and at one stage he threw the maps off the table as President Zelensky tried to explain where they were in terms of the front lines of fighting. I'm told that the line has been restored to Petro Poroshenko, so let's return to that interview. Hopefully this time you can hear me. So tell me what Kyiv wants to come out of today's meeting.
First of all, this is vitally important for us. The coalition of willing need to be the part of the three components. This is the strategy, this is the strength, and this is the speed. Strategy, because this is the only possible way how we can keep continent safe and sustainable security situation on the continent. Strength means that Putin understands only one thing: strength. And that's why we should be united. That's why we should be strong. And that's why we should be effective. And speed, because you cannot find out any other nation in the world who wants peace more than we Ukrainians.
I'm sure that is true. Let me ask you another question. How concerned were you last week when you were watching President Zelensky at the White House and you saw Donald Trump demand Ukraine hand over all of the Donbass, some of Russia's talking points, what they want, their objectives? How worried were you that you saw the president return to some of those demands for peace?
First of all, we don't have any other alternative than President Trump. Second, Trump is a window of opportunity. Trump is a deal maker, and Putin is a troublemaker. And everybody should not have any illusion. Third, I don't believe that the President Trump demand to give the territory to Putin as his own request. Trump, on contrary, demand to stop the war on the current battle line. And with that situation, I think that we Ukrainians accept. We are not trading our territory. We are not accepting any these type of things. And this is what the thing we should start is a ceasefire, unconditional, comprehensive, and immediate.
The difficulty, I suppose, is that Ukraine has said that for such a long time. Vladimir Putin has resisted for exactly the same period of time, and that is the logjam that nobody seems to get past. In terms of this European meeting, we saw Donald Trump say no to Tomahawk missiles. Should the Europeans say openly, we will give Ukraine more long-range missiles, Germany give them Taurus missiles? Have we reached that moment? That is what should happen from the Europeans. Leave the Americans out of this for now.
Again, how to stop the war? We need the three components. Components number one, weapons. And these weapons is not just 10 or 20 Tomahawks. Weapons number one is 1,000 Tomahawks. Why? Because Putin should not have any illusion that if he attacks us with 1,000 missiles, in return, he will receive 1,000 missiles. And that's why he thinks twice before attacking the object of the civilian critical energy infrastructure of Ukraine, understanding that he will have the same answer. I know President Trump. I work with him, and he never say no.
Yes.
He say maybe, but not now.
Let me ask you a final question, because we've touched on long-range missiles, but CBS, our American partners, are just reporting that Putin's envoy will meet with Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, in Miami. Are you worried at all? And certainly officials in Kyiv said this at the start of the week, that in a sense, Donald Trump is going round and round in circles when it comes to his policy with Putin. Do you worry about that as well, that in terms of headway, there is little headway? We keep asking and answering the same questions.
The purpose of this meeting is just to keep a dialogue, or nothing. Because the main message is produced by President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and State Secretary Rubio. And listening very attentively, the messages from all three sources I said, I have nothing to worry about, because this is the vital for Ukraine, but vital for Great Britain, vital for Europe, and vital for United States, vital for NATO. Keeping the unity, being strong, keeping the coalition of willing, and strongly believe in your own victory. If you do not believe in your victory, you never win. And with this situation, the position of Great Britain, position of NATO, position of President Trump, and position of Ukraine should be united. We should keep unity in the partnership, we should keep internal unity, and we should win.
Petro Poroshenko, we have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us live on today's programme. Thanks for your time. Well, much more on that story coming up a little later in our programme. Let's turn to a separate story also involving President Trump, because he has announced an immediate end to all trade negotiations with Canada because of an advert that criticises his tariffs on the country. Well, the advert, which is sponsored by the government of Canada's Ontario province, quotes former President Ronald Reagan saying that tariffs hurt every American. Well, President Trump wrote on social media that the advert was fake and egregious, adding that trade talks were hereby terminated. Of course, that was in capital letters. Well, we'll talk to BBC Verify in a moment. Here's a little, though, of the ad that has so enraged the president.
But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens.
Well, that's a little of the advert. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, has been talking to reporters in the last half an hour, saying his country is prepared to continue trade talks when the Americans are ready to have those discussions.
We can't control the trade policy of the United States. We recognize that that policy has fundamentally changed from the policy in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. And it's a situation where the United States has tariffs against every one of their trading partners to different degrees. And it's in that context that our officials, my colleagues, have been working with their American colleagues on detailed, constructive negotiations, discussions on specific transactions, specific sectors, steel, aluminum, and energy. And a lot of progress has been made. And we stand ready to pick up on that progress and build on that progress when the Americans are ready to have those discussions, because it will be for the benefit of workers in the United States, workers in Canada, and families in both of our countries.
Well, that was Mark Carney. With me here in the studio is Jake Horton, reporter from BBC Verify. Jake, Donald Trump says the ad is fake. It is clearly edited from a long Ronald Reagan speech, but fake?
So when he says fake, he means selected bits of audio have been taken from the original speech, and he says they have been taken and misrepresented what his predecessor, Ronald Reagan, had said. Now, he's right that the original speech was longer. It was 5 minutes long, and the advert is 1 minute long, so it certainly was shortened and edited to some extent. We've actually got a graphic we can show you here which shows the full text of the original speech, which, like I said, was 5 minutes long. And all the yellow bits highlighted in this graphic are the bits that are in the advert which has been published by the Ontario government in Canada. And some of these are reordered and they are much shorter, like I said. So when he says fake, he means they have been taken out of context, or what he says, they've been taken out of context and misrepresented.
Well, that is the key. So let me ask you that direct question. Does it misrepresent what Ronald Reagan was saying in the entirety of that speech?
So let me take you back to the 1980s when that speech was made by Ronald Reagan, and he was making it in anticipation for the Japanese Prime Minister visiting the US. And he was talking about how he was going to impose sanctions on Japan. And obviously Donald Trump is a proponent of tariffs on Japan. And Donald Trump is a proponent of tariffs. But Ronald Reagan went on to say that he was loath to do so. So he certainly wasn't advocating for tariffs across the board like we've seen in the US in recent months. So it's not true to say that the essence of the speech was misrepresented, because the bulk of the speech was critical of tariffs, as you heard in the advert which was broadcast in Canada.
Jake, thanks for taking us through all of that. You're going to stay with me because I'm going to come back to you in a moment or two about a separate story. But let's speak to Giles Gerson, who is the President and CEO of Toronto Regional Board of Trade. And thank you so much for being here with us. So your reaction, first of all, to talks terminated?
Well, Matthew, it's obviously a deeply disappointing setback. We've had months of hard work and good faith negotiation, as you heard Prime Minister Carney mention, and it appeared that we were on the cusp of at least a partial set of arrangements around some critical sectors: steel, aluminum, and energy. With the rest still to come, we were hoping. So to see the progress stall out at this stage, this is not the first kind of termination that we've had, but to see it stall out at this stage is quite frustrating.
Yes, we will see if it's a short-term political tantrum or a long-term position. If it is the latter, take me through the consequences of not making progress on these key areas.
Well, we've had tariffs now in place for quite a few months, and we've been treated like every other country, as Prime Minister Carney said. The problem for us is that we have a deeply integrated economy with the United States. And Ontario, in particular, a large manufacturing economy, and it's tied directly into the U.S. manufacturing economy. Supply chains are deeply integrated. And that's taken place over the last 40 years. And ironically, since we're talking about President Reagan, it was under President Reagan that the free trade deal, the first free trade deal with Canada was negotiated. I was a young reporter in Washington when that deal was negotiated. And we remember President Reagan as being, a free trader. And so this disrupting and trying to unravel this deeply integrated economy and supply chains is very costly. And so we're starting to see the costs in Ontario. We're seeing our steel industries lost half of its export market. Literally in the last several months, our auto industry is facing significant trade constraints and loss of sales and investment. We just seen a major auto plant in Ontario where the prospective model vehicle that was going to be produced there has been plucked out of that plant to be put into a U.S. plant in order to satisfy the requirements of the U.S. So this is having significant repercussions. I will say that our understanding is that what we're hearing from our members of the Board of Trade, our manufacturing members, is that their U.S. counterparts in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania are also feeling the brunt of tariffs as well.
Giles Gibson, sorry we have to leave it there, but we have a really busy half an hour. So thank you for that snapshot analysis of the response from Canada to what we are seeing. Well, Jake is still with me because we wanted to touch on the pictures from the White House that have caused consternation in the US. The bulldozers have been going all week, ripping down part of the East Wing, ready for the construction of the ballroom that Donald Trump wants to build. It is hugely controversial on many levels. The president promised that the building, the ballroom, wouldn't impact the historic building itself, a building that, of course, belongs to the public with all of its history. And whether approval was needed from Congress, that's been completely ignored by the president. And also one more area of contention, of course, who is actually paying. So let's bring Jake back in on several of those thoughts. Let's start with just the sort of demolition we are seeing and what the president said only a few weeks ago about what was or wasn't intended.
Yeah, so like you said, initially he said it would not interfere with the current structure. He said it would be near it, but not interfere with the current structure of the White House. And as we saw at the start of the week, the East Wing of the White House, the front of the East Wing, started to be demolished. Bits were torn off the front of the East Wing that you see there in those pictures. But at BBC Verify, we obtained fresh images overnight, satellite images, which showed the level of demolition from above, which were very stark. And you can see what it looked like in September and what it looks like now. Those are pictures yesterday, and you can see not only the entrance of the East Wing, the whole main building of the East Wing, and the corridor, the hallway that connected the East Wing to the main residence where the president stays at the White House is now completely gone. And this is something that President Trump has since said, since the construction started. He claims that the East Wing is completely separate to the White House. But as you can see there, it used to be connected by a hallway. So it isn't completely separate to the White House.
On a separate issue, I mean, we saw the press spokesman Caroline Levitt only yesterday saying the ballroom is the president's priority at the moment. That certainly raised eyebrows, given everything that the American public are actually going through at the moment. But I raised a couple of issues in the introduction, Congress and where the money is coming from. So take me through all of that.
Yeah, so it's going to be a 90,000 square foot in total ballroom, and the president wants it done quickly. He wants it done by the end of his term in 2029, and you can see here that's the projection that he's provided of what it will look like when it's completed in less than 3 years, potentially. And he said it's going to cost $300 million. A reminder that the White House, when it initially said the ballroom was going to be built, said $250 million. So that price has already gone up in a matter of days. When, in terms of who's paying for it, the president said he's going to pay for a large chunk of it himself. He said he's going to raise some of that money from donors, and the White House has published a list of those donors, which include big companies like Amazon, Meta, some really big household names. And this has caused concern in some levels of the US government that it amounts to buying access to the White House and to the president. When you talk about congressional approval, that isn't necessarily needed. Some presidents for renovations in the past have sought congressional approval, but they've also sought money from Congress to build the renovations, something that President Trump isn't doing.
Jake, thank you for taking us through all of that and taking us through some of those pictures. Around the world and across the UK, you are watching BBC News. Welcome back to today's Verified Live. Let's turn to sport because one of the world's oldest football clubs, Sheffield Wednesday, has asked to be put into administration. That news coming out a little earlier in the day. So let's get reaction. Let's speak to James Silverwood, who's the Vice Chair of the Sheffield Wednesday Football Club Supporters Trust. And James, welcome here to the programme. Well, what a day for you to do an interview like this. Give me your headline thoughts. It's pretty bleak, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't quite situate it as that. I think for a lot of Sheffield Wednesday fans, actually, which might be an unusual set of emotions for your listeners and viewers, but actually it's one of pride and elation, really, because the community has come together to tell Dave Chansiri, the previous owner, that his time at Sheffield Wednesday has to come to an end, which this news absolutely heralds. And then also elation because it means his ownership is coming to an end. It's been a decade long of mismanagement from top to bottom, and this brings about the possibility of a brighter future for Sheffield Wednesday, even if it brings about some short-term pain as well.
Well, let's talk about the short-term pain, and you talk about the mismanagement at different stages. There's been a failure to pay players and staff, and that's just some of what everyone has been going through there at the club, and we've had a fans boycott as well in recent weeks. But what comes with administration also is a 12-point deduction. You're already bottom of the championship. That almost would guarantee relegation, wouldn't it? So it comes with an enormous cost, doesn't it?
It comes with a cost, but if you ask the vast majority of Sheffield Wednesday fans whether a 12-point deduction was worth a future for the football club that doesn't involve Dave Chansiri, they will take the 12-point deduction. And I think if you look at the reaction online amongst the Sheffield Wednesday fans in terms of returning to the club shop today to start to buy the shirts and other merchandise that they denied themselves all summer through our defunding campaign, I think you can see that there is a sense of relief and elation amongst the fan base.
I suppose that only lasts if part, and that is what your hope, but there are other avenues, and potentially here it could be very, very bleak for the club.
Well, the Sheffield Wednesday Trust are going to act responsibly to make sure that that bleakest of options is not on the table, and we're going to do that by putting a fan-led takeover proposal to the administrators. We've been working on that for several months already behind the scenes. Plans are quite well advanced and they'll be announced in due course. So that bleakest of bleak options is going to be taken off the table. My view is that option probably won't be necessary. I think that Sheffield Wednesday, one of the oldest football clubs in the now global business of football, is bound to attract quite strong interest from potential buyers. So I think there's two reasons to perhaps take those bleak options off the table.
James, we are out of time, so sorry to cut you off there, but thanks very much for bringing us those thoughts there live on that story. Plenty more on all of our headline stories coming up just in a moment or two. Live from London, this is BBC News. The Coalition of the Willing is meeting now in London to explore new ways to step up NATO's military support for Ukraine. A warm reception as the UK Prime Minister and President Zelensky talk about the options ahead.
I do think that this week we can really bear down on Russian oil and gas. I think there's further we can do on long-range capability.
I'm very thankful to you that we are not alone in this situation from the very beginning of war.
Earlier, King Charles hosted the Ukrainian president at Windsor.
I'm Regina Vaidyanathan live in Downing Street now. Once that Coalition of the Willing summit wraps up, the leaders, so Prime Minister Starmer, President Zelensky and the NATO Secretary General will be giving a press conference. We'll bring that live to you in the next hour.
Our other headlines: Labour tumbles to a distant third in the Caerphilly by-election with an historic loss to the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru. Donald Trump says he's ending trade negotiations with Canada after the Canadians air an advert using archive footage of Ronald Reagan saying tariffs don't work. And the rise in reported cases of OCD in young people in the UK. We speak with those waiting for treatment who say it is not being taken seriously enough. Hello and welcome to Verified Live. Let's start with that hugely important meeting that is going on now, the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Well, President Zelensky spent a few hours in Downing Street earlier with the UK Prime Minister. Great pictures these, because he then headed with Keir Starmer to a meeting with other European leaders who supported Ukraine in the war against Russia. They spent a considerable amount of time talking there to Ukrainian refugees and also people who had gathered there just outside the Foreign Office. Keir Starmer is expected to push European allies to give Ukraine more long-range weapons. Well, a little earlier, the Ukrainian president held talks with King Charles at Windsor Castle, the third meeting between the two this year. Well, let's go straight back to Downing Street, back to my colleague Regina, who's monitoring all the events for us there. And Regina, that Coalition of the Willing talks with European leaders, we've seen pictures in the last 20 minutes or so. Just take me through some of the options that they are considering.
Well, as you say, that meeting is continuing at the Foreign Office, which is a short stroll from here in Downing Street. And earlier we saw Prime Minister Starmer and President Zelensky leave Number 10 to make that quick trip. And as you mentioned there, they were greeted by Ukrainian refugees and other British families who've helped take some of those refugees in and give them a home. And we saw the cheers as the pair arrived. But now it's down to business, as you say, Matthew. And I think it's important to remember that President Zelensky is often on feverish diplomatic missions to try and get more support for Ukraine. And the timing is crucial as well, because Ukraine's about to head into its bitter winter months. And that conflict continues on even overnight. We saw both sides of the conflict, Russia and Ukraine, attack each other in strikes. A reminder that as the diplomacy continues, the war carries on and families up and down those countries are still feeling the impact. Now, in terms of the options that are being discussed, well, more military support to Ukraine. We know Prime Minister Starmer wants to see more long-range missiles being provided to Ukraine so that they can strike deeper into Russia. There's also going to be more talk about how this Coalition of the Willing can help Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which has been hit during the years of conflict there. And of course, that is crucial as well, as I mentioned, because of the winter approaching as well. But it's been a long week in diplomacy, hasn't it, Matthew? Because it was only last Friday that President Zelensky was in Washington, D.C., where he met with the US President Donald Trump. And reports said that after that meeting, it sort of descended into a shouting match between the pair. Well, we've seen completely the opposite here, because we know that the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has a very strong bond with the Ukrainian president. Well, the pair had a private meeting before that summit kicked off this afternoon, and they shared these comments before their private talks. Let's have a listen.
We reaffirm again our support for you and Ukraine and our absolute commitment to meeting the challenge of Russian aggression. And whilst you have signalled the path for a way forward and shown that willingness and courage and determination, what we've seen from Putin is an absolute unwillingness to engage.
Putin doesn't show that he wants to stop the war, and he really began steps in pushing us to such humanitarian disaster. What he wants to organize this winter is, of course, with attacks on energy, on gas, on water supplies. It's understandable what to do. I'm very thankful to you that we are not alone in this situation.
President Zelensky and Prime Minister Starmer, well, as we were saying, they're in those talks right now. And in terms of a timetable, within the next hour, we are expecting a news conference, and the men will be joined by the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte as well. And they will take some questions as well, we understand. Well, I'm joined by BBC Monitoring's Vitaly Shevchenko. So those talks are continuing. Now, let's just be blunt here. This coalition of the willing, Vitaly, has been meeting on a number of occasions in recent months. What materially can be different in the outcome today?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Some of the key proposals put forward by the coalition of the willing have not been implemented. For example, a proposal to dispatch a so-called reassurance force to Ukraine, which means a military force comprised of European soldiers and UK soldiers as well, to safeguard some sort of peace agreement with Russia. Russia said no, that's not happened yet. And I found it really interesting that President Macron of France, who is attending this meeting of the coalition of the willing via a video link, again today he said that option is still on the table. But the hard fact remains that these proposals and plans put forward by groups such as the coalition of the willing, they will remain a pipe dream until these coalitions and groups come up with specific plans on how to make Russia accept those proposals. And by talking about new weapon supplies to Ukraine, by talking about how to remove Russian oil and gas from the global markets, that is one way of putting more pressure on Russia. What Volodymyr Zelensky will be expecting to hear is how exactly they are going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard from the British Prime Minister that he wants to ratchet up the pressure on President Putin. Now, earlier in the week, we did see that the US has imposed sanctions on two key Russian oil providers, Rosneft and Lukoil, and that the EU has added another phase of sanctions against Russia as well. Is that enough to put the pressure on, especially when we're hearing that the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is meeting his Russian counterpart?
Well, based on what I've been hearing from various commentators, including one former Russian government official, it's not even necessarily about new sanctions. It's about how old sanctions are enforced and about how these fresh restrictions, how serious Donald Trump's administration is going to be about enforcing them. When it comes to sanctions on Russia's two largest oil producers, most of Russia's crude is bought by two countries, India and China. Are they going to pay attention? We've been hearing reports from India that refineries there expect to dramatically cut imports from Russia. Are they going to resort to various networks of opaque networks of traders? Will Russia yet again use its fleet of shadow tankers to circumvent these sanctions? If that happens, those sanctions are not really going to be that effective. When it comes to the EU's 19th package of sanctions against Russia, the key point there is a ban on imports of Russian liquefied natural gas. At this moment in time, half of Russian LNG exports, they go to the EU. But that ban, it doesn't come into force until 2027. So some steps are being taken, but I'm sure Volodymyr Zelensky will be thinking that, well, look, we need more.
Indeed, and the question is, from what Vitaly has just said, is how much is that pressure actually being applied, even with existing sanctions? Well, as we were saying a little earlier, both Russia and Ukraine have been hit overnight by strikes. A reminder that the conflict does continue on. Well, let's hear from Kyiv and our correspondent there, John Sudworth.
Well, it's sometimes difficult, Regini, to follow the twists and turns and the ups and downs of Ukraine's efforts to rally allies to its support, even from the outside, let alone from Kyiv's position fighting this war. You know, as we've seen in recent weeks, so often disappointed in Washington. That meeting you've mentioned back in February, the sort of probably the low point, but reports of another difficult meeting within the past week or so. And so, you know, almost in inverse proportion to that, we've had Ukraine's European allies having to shore up support, having to rally to its defence. And again, we're seeing a display of that today in London. A couple of things I think are really important. First of all, you know, despite President Zelensky coming away from that meeting in Washington somewhat disappointed over Donald Trump's refusal to let him use these long-range US Tomahawk missiles, America has now, for the first time under this administration, you know, put in place a pretty stringent measure of sanctions against Russia's two biggest oil companies. Does that mean things are shifting again, that President Trump is finally running out of patience with Vladimir Putin? We simply don't know. Certainly no rush yet to give it long-range missiles. That still remains on hold, but a glimmer of hope. And I think this meeting in London, the really interesting thing to watch is the announcements that are made after in regard to that long-range weaponry, because Keir Starmer made it clear that he was going to push European allies to do more so that Ukraine can do what it really needs, what it's been asking to be given the ability to do for a long, long time, to increase its ability to strike targets inside Russia and take the fight to Moscow to put pressure on Vladimir Putin.
The view from Ukraine there from my colleague John Sudworth. So, Matthew, as that meeting wraps up, there will be, as I mentioned a short while ago, a news conference. Keir Starmer, Volodymyr Zelensky and Mark Rutte from NATO will answer questions and deliver some statements before the press. So we'll then find out a little bit more about what, if anything, has been agreed from those meetings.
Regini, thanks very much. We expect that in about 45-50 minutes' time. We obviously will carry it live. Let's speak to Colonel Brendan Kearney, military affairs analyst, retired Marine Corps colonel, and thank you so much for being here with us. We were just hearing the view from Kyiv. It will be repeated by President Zelensky that Ukraine wants a commitment for more long-range missiles. If they were to get it from the Europeans, how much does that change things, do you think?
Well, I think it would have an impact. I'm not sure it's going to be the thing that brings the Russians to the peace table, but anything that you can do, and Ukraine has already proved this, where you can go ahead and impact Russian infrastructure, their power capability, the ways that they can go ahead and refine oil, which in turn makes them money, I think is a good thing. And that's the thing that I think Zelensky and Ukraine are wisely targeting. They're not doing what the Russians are, which is targeting civilian population centers. They're going after the infrastructure and military locations throughout Russia.
Well, we're just putting on our screen some of the strikes because it's really interesting. You are right about the strategy we've seen from the Ukrainians recently, because it fits the sort of things that Donald Trump has always said about oil and the Russian energy sector and the economy. Ukraine has gone after the Russian refineries. That has been really effective, hasn't it, in terms of what it has taken out?
Yes, it has. And, you know, the refineries are the type of targets that when you hit them, like the Ukrainians have, they're not fixed overnight. We're talking weeks and months of repairs before you get them back up again. And the Ukrainians, in some cases, have gone ahead and hit refineries they'd previously hit. So I think it's a wise move that they're making, and I understand where the long-range missiles, a further capability, whether it's Tomahawks or something the EU decides to provide, is just simply opens up the target list much further into Russia. And I think it's the right thing to do, and I applaud the Ukrainians for going after that capability.
Just in terms of those longer range weapons, Storm Shadows are being talked about, Taurus from Germany, the pressure for the Germans to change their mind on that, even Tomahawks. I know that the president currently is saying no, but a quick question on this. How long technically would it take to actually acquire the knowledge for the Ukrainians to actually be able to use them if there was a green light given?
Oh, I think the Ukrainians have proven that not only are they technologically adept and innovative people, but they're more than capable of learning very, very quickly. I think we're talking in the manner of maybe 6 weeks to 2 months at the most before the Ukrainians, once they receive these systems and get the training. And remember, the training can always occur ahead of time. Most of the training for these type of very, very sophisticated systems is done through simulation, computer simulation. So you could start that literally, weeks prior to the delivery of the munitions themselves. And I think that's what has been done in the past and would be done again in this particular situation.
Yes, and you're absolutely right, because the Ukrainians, certainly with F-16s, they got up to speed much quicker than perhaps conventionally people thought it would take. A final thought, going back to what you were talking about, the Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil facilities, because we have seen a whole range, whether it's drones or longer range missiles. Just give me a thought about the psychological impact that potentially is happening with all of these strikes in Russia, because for a long while in what they call a special operation, all of this is going on a long way away from them. Suddenly, there are strikes inside Russia that they can see and are feeling the impacts from when it comes to fuel supplies.
Matthew, you're exactly right. What this has done has removed that sense of invincibility that the average Russian citizen had when this war started, as we're talking about, 3+ years ago. I think it has damaged Russian morale, and it has increased Ukrainian morale, because the Ukrainians, that sense of being at the receiving end of a punch all the time, it's very, very difficult to overcome. When you start punching back, and this is what the Ukrainians are doing so effectively, it's just good for Ukraine. It's good for Europe to see that the Russians are being punished for this continuing insanity that Putin insists on, promoting here with this conflict that is completely unnecessary.
Brendan Kenny, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us live on today's programme. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Matthew.
I want to turn to breaking news here, because the ringleader of an arson attack on a Ukraine-linked business here in London last year has been jailed today for 17 years for what prosecutors described as, quote, a sustained campaign of terrorism and sabotage on UK soil. Dylan Earle, who's 21, admitted aggravated arson over the 2024 blaze, which targeted companies delivering satellite equipment from Elon Musk's Starlink to Ukraine. Now, prosecutors said yesterday that he also discussed with his handler, who was linked to Russia's Wagner mercenary group, plans to kidnap the co-founder of the finance app Revolut and torture Warehouse 2 in the Czech Republic. So that news just coming from the courts in the last little while, that Dylan Earle has been sentenced to 17 years in prison. More on that as we get it. Around the world and across the UK, you are watching BBC News. Welcome back to BBC News. Let's turn to UK politics because Labour has suffered an historic loss in the Welsh parliamentary by-election in Caerphilly, an area it has dominated for over 100 years. Plaid Cymru won the seat with 47% of the vote, with Reform coming second, pushing Labour into third. Plaid have said that voters in South Wales chose progress over the tired status quo. Well, I've been speaking to Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, about his analysis of the result last night.
Well, the big question we were looking to this by-election to answer was the polling evidence that in Wales, limited as it was, that Labour were at risk of coming third in the general Senate election that is taking place in May next year when the whole of the Assembly will be elected. The risk that they would come third, and indeed the suggestion by some polling that they might come a very poor third, was there any reason to believe there was any credibility to that polling? The answer that came back from the voters of Caerphilly is that that risk does exist. The Labour Party has already said this is a constituency that ever since it was first created in 1918, Labour has always won. Go back to the days of when Tony Blair was first elected Prime Minister, Labour got 2/3 of the vote in the constituency. They got just 11% on Thursday. So this was a very dramatic loss for Labour. The truth is, there are clearly good reason to anticipate that Labour would be in difficulty in Wales. Number one is that the party has been criticised for quite some time for its governance of Wales as the devolved government for Wales. And we saw in the general election last year support for the party fall back in Wales by 4 points when it was advancing in most of the rest of England and of Scotland. And secondly, of course, this by-election has taken place at a time when the UK Labour government, its polling rating is just 20%. It is an all-time low, and there is clearly deep dissatisfaction with many voters throughout the UK who voted Labour last year and who are now rather disenchanted. Put those two things together, and you can see why this was a very, very difficult seat for Labour to defend despite its history.
Two quick points in one, if you would. The two main parties, you've alluded to it, 13% of the vote in total between Labour and Conservatives. We're running into new territory, aren't we, of a fractured landscape. There was also tactical voting. People knew it was a straight fight between Plaid and Reform, and I suppose in terms of those wavering, made sure that it wasn't Reform.
Well, I did pick up your 2 points. Yes, the other big question that we're facing at the moment about the future of British politics is, are we beginning to see the death of the traditional two-party system where our politics is dominated by Conservative and Labour? Their share of the vote in the general election last year was at an all-time low. And now, as you say, just 13% in this by-election. Caerphilly indicates that the question of the future of our politics for the two largest parties is a very, very live issue. Tactical voting, yes, probably Reform benefit from this. Labour are trying to take some comfort from that, but the trouble is the message that comes from Caerphilly is that indeed, if you want to defeat Reform, Plaid seems to be a better place to do it. That's also the message from the polling in Wales. And the risk for Labour is that some voters will take the message that that's exactly what they should also do next May.
Straight to breaking news. It involves Prince Andrew. Let me tell you what we're hearing from our business correspondent, that Prince Andrew has removed his royal titles from Companies House, changing his name from HRH, the Duke of York, KG, to Prince Andrew. Following increasing pressure over his links to the sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, Prince Andrew agreed to stop using most of his royal titles, including the Duke of York and the Knight of the Garter. He made that announcement last Friday, you may remember. The Most Noble Order of the Garter is the oldest and most senior order of chivalry in Britain. Members usually put the letters KG after their names. Now, a document has been filed registering a change of Andrew's details as a person with, quote, significant control of Pitch at Palace Global Limited, the parent company for the global arm of Prince Andrew's startup business network. The change was registered apparently on Wednesday, according to the documents, at what point Pitch at Palace was seen as a possible source of funding for the Duke when a Dutch company, Startup Bootcamp, discussed a possible takeover. However, the deal collapsed earlier this year. You'll remember that Prince Andrew said he would stop using the titles because of the, quote, continued accusations about me distracting the work of His Majesty and the royal family. And in a statement, he also said, I vigorously deny the accusations against me. Well, Prince Andrew, you will know, had already agreed to stop styling himself His Royal Highness back in 2022 as he battled a US civil case over the allegations of sexual assault, though he does not appear to have updated the Pitch at Palace paperwork following that decision. Now, another interesting line from all of this and the documentation is his address is still listed as Royal Lodge, the 30-room house at Windsor Great Park, which he occupies on a long lease from the Crown Estate. You will recall, of course, many questions over the last week or so about the Royal Lodge and his continued residence there. And in recent years, Prince Andrew has also listed himself as Andrew Inverness, or HRA Andrew Inverness, on Companies House, referring to another of his royal titles, the Earl of Inverness. He has agreed to stop using that title as well. So just a repeat of the top line, that Prince Andrew has removed his royal titles from Companies House, changing his name from HRH, the Duke of York, KG, to Prince Andrew. That news just coming into us. Now, we're going to take a short break in a while. One more story to bring you, because the clocks go back this weekend in some parts of the world, and while for many people it means an extra hour in bed, not everyone is a fan of the tradition of daylight saving time. Some people say changing the clocks twice a year upsets the body's natural rhythm and disrupts sleep, which can lead to health problems. But others say without it, winter mornings will be darker and more unsafe. Here's our correspondent, David Sillito.
It's the weekend to change the clocks, an extra hour in bed, but also for some, a disruption to sleep patterns, a topic that's of increasing concern.
Today we've got a few songs like Sleeping Bunnies,
Which is what took me to this, the Together Project, a weekly intergenerational get-together to see if attitudes to sleep really are changing. And it soon became clear the older generation were very relaxed about the clock change, and also about what bedtimes they'd had over the years.
Very late, actually. I'd stay up sometimes till midnight and watch something or read, and so I didn't have a regular bedtime.
I went to sleep around 11, 12 and got up at 6 o'clock in the morning.
The younger visitors, well, bedtimes were rather different, and the clock change, far from popular.
I would say I typically try to be in bed by about 10 p.m. I sort of see sleep as part of my overall wellness.
If they didn't do it, would it be better or worse?
I don't think it should be a thing anymore. I think it disrupts a lot of people. I think it had a time and a place when it was first instituted, when we were a farming society, and we're not anymore.
The UK did abolish the clock change in the 60s, but the effects, such as going to school in the dark in the north, led to us reverting back in the 70s. America has made moves to abolish it, and there have been multiple attempts in the UK. But this concern about sleep has given us new information about the world's sleep habits. A new global study has been looking at data from thousands of under-mattress sensors that an increasing number of people now use to track their sleep patterns.
In the UK, there does tend to be quite late bedtimes, and in turn quite late wake-up times as well. So we're showing about a 11 p.m, 11:30 p.m. bedtime and about a 7:30, 8 a.m. wake-up time.
So, a little insight into our sleeping habits. But would we be better off without this weekend's extra hour? David Sillito, BBC News.
Well, we're going to take a short break. Let me show you the pictures live from Downing Street, because we are expecting that news conference. President Zelensky was there at number 10 a little earlier. He's currently meeting with the Coalition of the Willing, a news conference in the next hour. Do stay with us here on BBC News. Welcome back to BBC News. Let's turn to our main headlines here. The British Prime Minister calls on allies to bolster Ukraine's long-range weapons capability as the Coalition of the Willing meet in London to step up NATO's military assistance to the country.
So I'm pleased that we're accelerating our UK programme to provide Ukraine with more than 5,000 lightweight missiles.
Everything Putin does is an attempt to delay new forms of pressure.
Earlier, there was the warmest of receptions as Keir Starmer and President Zelensky talked about the various options ahead. Our other headlines: Labour tumbles to a distant third in the Caerphilly by-election with an historic loss to the Welsh Nationalist Party, Plaid Cymru. Donald Trump says he is ending trade negotiations with Canada after the Canadians air an advert using archive footage of Ronald Reagan saying tariffs don't work. And Sheffield Wednesday have filed for administration. We get reaction to that news. And the rise of reported cases of OCD in young people in the UK. We speak with those waiting for treatment who say it is not being taken seriously enough. First, though, a Sudanese asylum seeker has been found guilty of murdering a hotel worker in the West Midlands. Rhiannon White was stabbed with a screwdriver on a platform of a railway station in Walsall in October of last year and died 3 days later in hospital. Deng Majek had been staying at the Park Inn Hotel with other asylum seekers where Miss White worked. Well, John Maguire has been following the case at Wolverhampton Crown Court.
It took the jury here at Wolverhampton Crown Court just over 2 hours to reach their unanimous verdict. They were considering the case of Rhiannon White. Just over a year ago in Walsall, she had been working in a hotel, the Park Inn Hotel in Walsall, that at the time was housing asylum seekers. She'd done a late shift on a Sunday night, was heading home, walked across the car park to a nearby railway station where she was going to catch the train home. She never made it home. On the station, on the platform, she'd been followed by one of the residents of the hotel, Majek, who caught up with her and stabbed her with a screwdriver 23 times, including causing severe brain injuries. She died in hospital 3 days later. After committing the murder, Majek was then filmed going and buying alcohol and returning to the hotel, where he was seen dancing around, almost celebrating. Blue lights were seen flashing in the background. Those were the lights of the emergency services that had been called in to try to save Rhiannon's life. She was a 27-year-old mother of a young son who's being brought up by one of her sisters. Her family have just paid emotional tribute to her after the 2-week-long trial, and the judge went to great lengths to praise the family for their dignity and their strength throughout what has been an extremely difficult time for Rhiannon's family. They say she will live on in their hearts. They'll never forget her and still struggle to understand why she was murdered.
John Maguire there at the courthouse. Meanwhile, 2 men have appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court charged with arson with intent to endanger life at a mosque in Peacehaven in Sussex. 38-year-old Ricky Ryder and 34-year-old Jack Slowey are accused of pouring flammable liquid into Peacehaven Mosque and setting it alight earlier this month. 2 people were inside the mosque at the time but were able to get out unharmed. Ricky Ryder and Jack Slowey have been remanded in custody until the 14th of November when they'll stand trial at the Old Bailey. And a man has been sentenced to a minimum of 40 years in prison for murdering 2 men and dumping their bodies in suitcases. Justin Mosquera murdered Paul Longworth and Albert Alfonso in London and then transported their remains in the suitcases to Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, where they were discovered by staff working there. Mosquera has also been sentenced to 16 months in jail for possession of indecent images of children. He'll serve the 2 sentences concurrently. Now, Donald Trump has announced an immediate end to all trade negotiations with Canada because of an advert that criticises his tariffs on the country. The advert, which is sponsored by the Government of Canada's Ontario province, quotes the former President Ronald Reagan saying that tariffs hurt every American. President Trump wrote on social media that the advert was fake adding that trade talks were hereby terminated. Well, here's a little bit of that ad that so enraged the president.
But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens.
Well, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney told reporters about a couple of hours ago his country is prepared to continue trade talks when the Americans are ready to actually return to discussions.
We can't control the trade policy of the United States. We recognize that that policy has fundamentally changed from the policy in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s. And it's a situation where the United States has tariffs against every one of their trading partners to different degrees. And it's in that context that our officials, my colleagues, have been working with their American colleagues on detailed, constructive negotiations, discussions on specific transactions, specific sectors, steel, aluminum, and energy. And a lot of progress has been made. And we stand ready to pick up on that progress and build on that progress when the Americans are ready to have those discussions, because it will be for the benefit of workers in the United States, workers in Canada, and families in both of our countries.
Well, that was Mark Carney. Giles Gerson is the president and CEO of the Toronto Regional Board of Trade. I spoke to him earlier and he gave me his reaction to the breakdown of these trade talks.
We've had months of hard work and good faith negotiation, as you heard Prime Minister Carney mention, and it appeared that we were on the cusp of at least a partial set of arrangements around some critical sectors, steel, aluminum, and energy. With the rest still to come, we were hoping. So to see the progress stall out at this stage, this is not the first kind of termination that we've had, but to see it stall out at this stage is quite frustrating.
Yes, we will see if it's a short-term political tantrum or a long-term position. If it is the latter, take me through the consequences of not making progress on these key areas.
Well, we've had tariffs now in place for quite a few months, and we've been treated like every other country, as Prime Minister Carney said. The problem for us is that we have a deeply integrated economy with the United States. In Ontario, in particular, a large manufacturing economy, and it's tied directly into the U.S. manufacturing economy. Supply chains are deeply integrated, and that's taken place over the last 40 years. And ironically, since we're talking about President Reagan, it was under President Reagan that the free trade deal, the first free trade deal with Canada, was negotiated. I was a young reporter in Washington when that deal was negotiated, and we remember President Reagan as being, a free trader. And so this disrupting and trying to unravel this deeply integrated economy and supply chains is very costly. And so we're starting to see the costs in Ontario. We're seeing our steel industries lost half of its export market. Literally in the last several months, our auto industry is facing significant trade constraints and loss of sales and investment. We just seen a major auto plant in Ontario where the prospective model vehicle that was going to be produced there has been plucked out of that plant to be put into a U.S. plant in order to satisfy the requirements of the U.S. So this is having significant repercussions. I will say that our understanding is that what we're hearing from our members of the Board of Trade, our manufacturing members, is that their U.S. counterparts in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania are also feeling the brunt of tariffs as well.
Well, that's the latest on the breakdown of trade talks between the US and Canada. If there's movement, we'll obviously return to that. We're going to take a short break. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.